Our topic is a lawyer's view of your aviation insurance policy. And our first speaker, of course, it will be Jim Viola, the president and CEO of Helicopter Association International. And then we have Greg Popp, who is of counsel with Hassell-Legal in Daytona Beach, Florida. This will be interactive. We do encourage you to ask questions. There is a question module in the control panel on the side of your screen. Simply open that up, type your question in, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as we can before the at the end of the webinar. We will hold all questions until the end. This video or this webinar is being recorded, as always. We will make the video available to those everybody who's watching it and those who aren't. It'll be posted to YouTube either tomorrow or possibly Monday at the latest, depending on how quickly the video can be rendered. With that, I'd like to introduce Jim Viola, President and CEO of HAI.
Hello, thanks Dan, and thanks for joining us today. As always, we're talking about, just about a year ago, our industry and the world changed significantly. No one really knew what was happening, with a variety of sources providing, information and that was incomplete or already had changed. With that in mind, we began this series of webinars to provide much needed advice and information to the industry as we dealt with the pandemic and as you dealt with the pandemic. Since then, these weekly webinars have evolved as we share information on a variety of topics. Many of the topics address safety, and others, like today's topic, focus on helping rotorcraft businesses. While the webinars have evolved, the pandemic continued to affect our world and our industry. As a result, as most people know, we had to cancel this year's HAI Heli Expo, and that meant that we might miss the opportunity of offering any of the professional education courses and or the classes from Rotor Safety Challenge that have gone over so well every year. We know, and certainly have heard, that many of you asked that question right up front on the cancellation because you look forward to those classes. So we are bringing some of those to you through these webinars, and also we're adding additional virtual events. As an example, next week we're canceling this webinar to bring you 4 days of virtual manufacturers technical briefings. They're straight from the airframe and engine OEMs, so really appreciate them stepping forward. And this information, the free information from the classes before, has been well attended, and so providing training for the operators, the repair facilities, and also those seeking IA renewal, that will all be accomplished next week. The additional thing we're doing, which we also did at Heli Expo, is the Flight Instructor Refresher course. So that course, a virtual Flight Instructor Refresher course, will be starting this coming Sunday. Dan will give you additional information about both the manufacturer technical briefings and also the virtual Flight Instructor Refresher course at the end of today's webinars. So you still have plenty of time to sign up. Today, however, we are bringing you one of the more popular courses from the Rotor Safety Challenge every year at Heli Expo. It's the aviation attorney, Greg Popp, has recently taught this course in 2020 HAI Heli Expo in Anaheim, for those that were there, and agreed to present this course again today. Insurance is never really glamorous, but it's always a requirement for flight operations. Today, your insurance coverage may dictate a lot about what you fly, where you fly, and when you fly, and actually what you might do as far as missions with your aircraft. So essentially, insurance is absolutely essential for every business. And that's why it's critical for your success that you understand the aviation insurance business and how that does affect you. So let's get started, and Greg will help us navigate through the world of aviation insurance policies. Dan, back to you.
Okay, Greg, there we go. I'll let you go ahead and take over. Greg, you're muted. Can't hear you.
Oh, there we go. Again, thank you for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I want to thank everyone who's here as attendees for taking the time to join my presentation. It's a pleasure to do this for you. As Jim said, I did this in Anaheim, and I do want to give credit where credit is due. As it actually turns out, my colleague Brad Hassell prepared this presentation, was the individual who was going to deliver it in Anaheim, and then had actually a conflict with a court scheduled matter involving an aviation case. And so I was the pinch hitter, but I certainly feel qualified to talk about the subject, having spent now in my 46th year as an attorney. And hopefully I'll be able to share with you some valuable things that you can take home and put to good use. One of the comments I have to make, which is in the promotion for the presentation, the decades of experience, and while there's some accuracy to that, I'm afraid the decades relate more to my age and years as opposed to the experience. At least that's the way I feel about it. But because at this point in time, I'm mostly retired and focused primarily on speaking, and then a magistrate's position for a local community here in Volusia or Flagler County, Florida. But with all that said, let's get started. And I urge you to pay attention closely. You wouldn't want to miss important points that you might find as questions on the quiz. So stay tuned. All right. I will try not to kill you with death by PowerPoint, but if we got a good view on the slides.
You do, yes.
All right, great. All right, well, that's our topic. The view of your aviation insurance policy as the perspective of an attorney. And a little bit about myself. Well, maybe a lot about myself. As I say, I've been practicing law since 1976, and I'm affiliated with Hassell-Legal, PA, here in Daytona Beach. The practice involves primarily a defense practice for various insurers and their insureds. A significant component of that is in aviation matters of all types, which actually takes the attorneys all over the country and sometimes out of the country. Matters have been handled outside the U.S. and certainly throughout various regions and jurisdictions within the United States. I went to the University of Miami, go Canes, and I have practiced in a variety of settings. I've done a variety of things as an attorney, one being as counsel to Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University's worldwide campus. At one point, I had an opportunity to work under the Office of the Governor here in Florida with the Florida Space Authority, which is an economic development arm of space activity, which is, you probably are well aware, is very brisk in Florida these days. SpaceX and Blue Origin really ramping up for an incredibly busy schedule of space activity. I've been chairman of an airport authority governing 3 airports, and been on the Florida Bar Aviation Law Committee for many years, having been a chairman, and also as the lead on the board certification course for the attorneys here in Florida. And I think it's an interesting point, and I share this with you from the standpoint that when you look for someone to work with who has expertise in the aviation law, be very cautious, because the field of competent counsel in that arena is actually quite small. In Florida, we have about 110,000 licensed attorneys, but the board certified attorneys in the state of Florida and the total who practice aviation law is as a regular matter is less than 200 or 250, and the board certified lawyers are only about 50 in number, which says a lot about the nature of the practice. It is a boutique or specialty practice. So if you have to look for counsel, make sure that you take the time to seek out somebody who has that experience. I've owned aircraft, got maybe something close to 3,000 flight hours. I'm not a rotary pilot, although I do have some stick time in Rotary, which I found to be akin to standing on top of the ball, chewing gum, patting my head, and hoping that I didn't kill myself. But I did spend a best part of a decade with Bristow helicopters at the Bristow Academy, and when their operations were here in Titusville, and working with the Rotary industry on a global basis, and which has been a big motivation for my participation in the teaching programs with HAI and working with the industry generally. I value the relationships I've developed, and quite frankly, doing what I'm doing right now is important to me from the standpoint of maintaining those relationships that I developed and actually cultivating new ones. So hopefully at some point we'll be face to face where we have an opportunity to shake hands and say hello and get acquainted on a little more personal basis. So what we're going to talk about today, let me just run through sort of the overview so that you have an idea what's coming. We're going to look at the different types of policies, address what those coverages are, and the coverage in the liability arena is somewhat along the lines of who, what, when, where, why, and how, as is listed there, and the things that you need to be very sensitive to from the standpoint of what your obligations are and where the traps and pitfalls are that could bite you if you fail to follow what the contractual obligations that exist under the policy are for you as the insured. And then we'll talk about first party coverages, which is the coverage that is there for your benefit, whether it's your aircraft injuries or things of that sort. And then we'll conclude with a Q&A period. There are a host of different kinds of policies. And it's interesting, you'll note that, and if you've had exposure with aircraft insurance, the airframe itself is called the hull. And you may wonder why that is. Well, I did a stint as counsel to a maritime insurer early in my practice, and aviation insurance in many respects is an outgrowth and expansion on maritime insurance that goes back many centuries, and thus the description of the airframe as the hull. And then we have coverages that speak to airport liability, and that will involve the things such as premises, hangar keeper, damaged aircraft if it's in the possession of a bailee, and product coverage, and then workman's comp for those who are running an aviation business, product liability for those who manufacture or provide components, and of course, manufacturer's policies. So when we're looking at a policy, what do we need to be thinking about? And this really brings it down to the bare bones of what you need to be looking for when you're shopping or examining examining coverage or shopping for coverage. What is it going to cover? Who is it going to cover? Who's it going to pay? When is it going to provide that coverage? Where is that coverage available? And of course, how much does it cover? If you can, you should take notes on this, because these are the critical things that you need to remember when you're looking. So moving to liability, and first component of that is the what. And I don't want to just be reading slides, but I'm going to, unfortunately, I don't have the ability to engage directly with you. So bear with me, and hopefully then I can expand on the topics as we go along. Obviously, liability coverage is to protect you as the insured for things that you may be legally accountable to others for having caused injury, damage, or loss. And by way of example, here is language right out of a policy an aviation policy that speaks to this topic. We will pay those sums that an insured, notice that insured is a defined term, becomes legally obligated to pay as damages because of bodily injury, another defined term, sustained by any person caused by an occurrence. There will be definitions that describe these defined terms. And so you need to be aware when you look at a policy, what do those definitions actually say? So you be sure that you know the scope of the coverage that's being provided and resulting from the ownership, maintenance, or use of a covered aircraft. So that's where you start. So it's a broad beginning, but then we move to what is taken away by virtue of exclusions. So an intentional loss. Do you think an insurer should accept responsibility for something that you do intentionally? I suggest they won't, and that they shouldn't, and the policies are going to say that. Bodily injury to you or an employee. The reason is that's within the scope of the insured. That's not a third party that you have accountability to. So there will be no coverage there. Claims for your own property or aircraft. That's where the first party coverage has to come in. But if your aircraft is damaged in the process of damaging another's, an example being, we had a case that the airliner taxiing on a ramp did damage to an insured's private jet, and that ended up in a dispute over, who was really responsible. Was it the airliner? Was it the FBO and their employees that were supposedly guiding the aircraft, et cetera? Obviously, it wasn't the insured's aircraft because it was parked, but and where the FBO had put it. But there would be no coverage in that instance, the airliner's damage because of the fact it was the offending aircraft. For noise or pollution, those are exceptions. And if you look at your homeowner's policy or you look at your automobile policy, and by the way, while I'm touching on that, the principles that we're talking about here do translate over to other coverages such as those. And I think very few of us are without automobile insurance or without homeowners coverages. So, the lessons here are applicable to those environments as well. War, martial law, riot, strikes, sabotage, confiscation. Obviously, those are extraordinary events. And if insureds do not have the ability to assess and extract premiums that would address those kind of events, and that's why they're going to be accepted from coverage. And then lastly, assume liability. I don't, there are many instances where we're asked to assume liability, and we have to be very cautious about that. I, for one, am a sailing racer, and in many of the registration agreements and liability documentation that attends to those events, there is sometimes provisions where you're asked to hold harmless the organizing entity and to accept the responsibility for any liability that may be imposed upon them by virtue of your participation and arguably something that you did or did not do in the course of that participation. Be very careful in looking at those, because sometimes you may be taking on a lot more responsibility than you might recognize. I, for one, am inclined to refuse to accept that. It's shifting burdens in a way that I consider to be not necessarily fair. So pay attention when you see these things. It boils down to make sure that you read what you're being asked to sign, because once you sign it, it's going to be assumed legally that you did read it and you knew what you were accepting as responsibility. The what? These are areas where there are lots of landmines, and the aircraft is operated by an approved pilot. I can't tell you how many times the pilot is not necessarily, when a loss occurs, within the scope of what's considered to be required or approved by the insurer in the language of the insurance contract. Do they have the certifications? Are they current? Do they have the hours? You need to know what is expected in that realm so that anyone who is going to be flying that aircraft is going to be within the scope of what is expected. Aircraft is airworthy. There's another potential landmine. If for some reason there are issues that an event happens and the aircraft was deemed to be unairworthy, there could be a denial of coverage, and that is something you need to be very careful about. Truthfulness. Quite frankly, fidelity in our representations are critical. The insurer and the underwriters with the insurer are going to rely on the representations that you make. And if there are representations made that are inaccurate or untruthful, the coverage can be voided. And that is a serious concern, because just when you need it the most, you may find that you do not have the coverage that you were hoping for or counting on. Prompt notice. If something happens, another example from the sailing world, an individual as a guest was sailing on a club boat with a club member, and in the course of disembarking from this boat, fell and was seriously injured. And I found out that there was reluctance to report this incident to the insurer because they didn't want to create a potential situation for the premiums and rates on the coverage or to be raised, or for the coverage to be canceled. Well, guess what? You report that right now, because if you do not, they're in a position to deny the benefits of the policy. And so prompt notice is important. And what is the reason for prompt notice? It gives the insurer the opportunity to move quickly to investigate, to analyze the responsibility, to make efforts to mitigate claims. So as an insured, you have a duty to cooperate, and notice is one of those critical items. And then the cooperation continues if there is a claim that's made, and just in cooperating with the investigators and or attorneys that may be involved in addressing the claim. Obviously, an insurer is not in a position to act on your behalf if you're not giving them the tools necessary to do the job. And then lastly, subrogation considerations. What is subrogation? Essentially, subrogation exists on almost all insurance policies. And what it says is that if the insurer, in providing the coverage to you, has a loss, a payment they've made, and there is some other party that is legally responsible or can be held legally responsible for the event, then they are going to have the right to step into your shoes to pursue recovery from that other party. And again, there is an obligation on your part to assist in and cooperate in making that happen. And obviously that is so that the insurers can be made whole for things that they really should not have been responsible for providing payment. The who. Who is the named insured? You know, it's real important that there be care taken to be sure that the insured entity is correctly identified in the policy. And sometimes, you know, there will be additional named insureds added, or as part of a initial issuance of a policy that, and again, there the critical. It's critical that those individuals or entities be be properly identified. Your employees, while they're doing their job as part of their work for you as a business owner, they're going to be covered for things that they do that result in losses to others and expose you. The concept there, of course, is an employee is an extension of you as an owner or operator, whether it's you, an individual, or you as a fictional organization, corporation, LLC, or other type of entity. They are going to make you liable through the concept of vicarious liability, and they respond to you as the superior, the Latin term respondeat superior, for their duty, and you in turn for liability that they may impose on you. Then if it's an aircraft that you're putting out for others to use, then that aircraft with your permission falls within the coverage of the policy. Generally, again, it's an area that you need to be careful to look at in order to make sure that that exists if that is something you're going to do. And then anyone riding in an insured aircraft with the permission of the owner or the owner's agent or representative. And so we're now talking about the passengers. And I'll touch on that for a second. In GA, general aviation, typically coverage is going to be fairly limited. Normally, and these days, the insurers are not real eager to provide high liability, because ultimately they can end up having to pay whatever coverage there is if there is an event, largely because aviation related claims tend to yield very big verdicts or very large settlements. The minds of the public, aviation is dangerous, and anybody who's doing it should be accountable, and so multi-million-dollar outcomes are fairly routine, and that's one of the reasons why premiums are going up and coverages are becoming more limited or difficult to obtain, is just because the exposures out there are on a spiraling upward direction. Typically, though, you're looking at $1 million overall liability policy, but in a four-seat aircraft, there's going to be a seat limitation as to how much coverage, and that's normally going to be $100,000 per seat. So is there really $1 million worth of liability, or is it really something less than that? And the answer is yes. But if you're ever in that situation, be prepared, because that may be what you're dealing with. Who isn't? Well, the manufacturers or sellers of the aircraft, they better have their own coverage, because it's not going to be covered under your policy as an owner or operator. A repair shop, if you put your aircraft in for maintenance and there's a loss that results within the scope of their possession, or someone selling your aircraft, or these other entities, they're not going to be covered under your policy. But as you can see in the bracketed addition, that they can be added by endorsement as an additional insured. And that is an area where you need to pay attention if you're in the arena where those considerations have to be brought to mind. The operator of an airport or a hangar or other aviation facility is not going to be covered. Again, they have to have their own coverages. Any of their employees, for all of these folks, or your employees when they injure another of your employees. And sadly, it seems to be recurring that these days workplace conflicts are, I don't know whether it's the stressors of modern life or what, but you see more and more instances where there are situations that result in tragedies at the worst, and at the minimum, conflicts that make it very difficult for individuals as employers to resolve when they have employees that just aren't getting along. So there will not be coverage if they hurt one another under your aviation policy. When? So we are talking about here, a loss must occur within the effective dates of the policy. So make sure that you know when your policy goes into effect and when its end date's going to be. Normally, these are going to be at 12:01 a.m. and 11:59 p.m. on an end date, but the worst thing would be to have your coverage lapse because of the fact that either it wasn't renewed or there was a failure to make a premium payment, which obviously is going to have trigger. And normally there's a notice obligation if you are delinquent in premium payments. But you know, in aviation policy, you're looking at a defined period of time when there will be coverage available, and outside that, no coverage. Claims made policies, and these are the kind of things that lawyers or accountants or others who are licensed professionals typically have. It doesn't matter when the loss occurred. What it does matter is when the claim is brought, and that's when it falls within the policy time frame. Where here's language right out of a actual aviation policy. You're covered for occurrence to take place during the period when you're in the United States territories, possessions, Canada, Mexico, the Bahamas, islands of the West Indies, or while en route between these places. But you'll note that it speaks in the next provision, it excludes Cuba. Why is that? Well, there are problems if you end up in Cuba because sometimes aircraft are seized, all kinds of considerations, or essentially ransom is required to recover your aircraft, and the insurer does not want to have to accept the responsibility for that happening. So if you are ever overflying Cuba, be prepared that you may be self-insuring if you have to end up in Cuba. You'll also note that that provision is addressing the nature of the coverage provided for the losses that while it's within North America or while en route. Hopefully I'm not going too fast. I'm just trying to stay on time. So please, there's no way I'll know otherwise, but hopefully it's not going so fast as to leave you in the wake. How much? Policy limits are typically stated on the declarations page. Now, the deck page is going to be your face page in your document, and it's essentially a summary of your coverage and what you can look to in terms of limits that are going to be there, and the period of the policy and things of that sort. And you'll note that there can be different policy limits for different insureds. Again, this is where it's important to work with your agent or broker and make sure that you're tailoring the coverage for what your needs actually are. It's really important that you have a relationship with an agent or a broker who knows you and your business so that they're best positioned to provide the kind of service to you that you need in shopping for the coverage and tailoring that coverage that fits you. You don't want to be buying coverage you don't need, and you don't want to be without coverage that you really need. And so that's where those relationships are very important. There can be different policy limits for different claims. You can have comprehensive single limit policies. You can have per occurrence policies with sub limits. And a lot of this is, again, related to the nature of what you're doing and the potential exposures that you may be at risk of from the standpoint of the type of coverage that you want to have. Limits that exclude passenger claims, and then of course deductibles. Today, deductibles, essentially move into the arena where you are accepting a certain level of risk in order to reduce the exposure to the insurer and the amount of premium that you're going to have to pay for the coverage that they will provide. Essentially, you become a partner in any claims that might result by virtue of saying, we'll accept the first 25,000 or 100,000 or 5 million of loss, depending on the size of your business and capability. And then anything that exceeds that becomes the responsibility of the insurer. Certainly one of the most critical things is where we're talking about now, the how much. And these are the elements where I think that people fail to recognize the importance of coverage and why you really need to have coverage. The expenses of defense. I will tell you that chasing documentation or information, expert witness fees, expert witnesses in aviation cases, it is not unusual for those costs to exceed literally 6 figures. And sometimes in really serious cases, that number will be considerably higher than that. That is a cost that will be covered under your policy. Of course, up to limits. Court costs incurred in defending. And court costs can be substantial. We're talking about witness fees, subpoena costs, service of process, you name it. Court costs that may be taxed against you as the insured. And if you have an adverse result, then you can anticipate that there will be, in addition to a judgment, court costs that will be imposed, and that would be under, again, subject to limits within the scope of your policy. Interest, pre-judgment interest can be awarded if there are some certain, and this could be added to the amount of a judgment, so that again comes within the scope of coverage. And then we come to the real, gorilla in the midst here, and that's the attorney's fees. The cost to defend can be extensive. There was recently a case that resulted from a tragedy with a loss of a helicopter with multiple fatalities, and initially the parties named as defendants by the plaintiff's counsel was somewhere in the neighborhood of 130 different defendants. 130. Anybody who had anything to do in any way with that aircraft was named as a defendant in that case. Now, ultimately, most of those folks were dismissed from the case by virtue of the fact that they did not have any relationship to the ultimate loss. But at the outset, they had to defend themselves, which meant they had to have counsel. So we're talking about 130 different lawyers or law firms to address this claim. Imagine the cost, because they have to come up to speed as to what happened, who's involved, what's the scope of potential liability, etc. Even those who got out had big expenses. And if you're in it for the long run, the numbers can be very large. Again, 6+ figures is not a lot by any standard, and 7+ figures is fairly common in serious cases. So one of the most important considerations of a policy is that your defense costs are there. Even if you don't think you have a lot of exposure because you're, quote, judgment proof, you don't have assets, you still could be subjected to having to defend yourself if there's an adverse event. And this is where having coverage is really important, because the insurer will have the obligation to step up to defend you. Now, I'll make a comment there. If for some reason the insurer believes that they don't have responsibility to provide the liability coverage, they could issue a reservation of rights letter to you as the insured saying, hey, we don't think we're responsible, so we're reserving our right to deny the coverage, but they will still provide you a defense up to and including the point that that issue is resolved one way or the other. If there's an appeal, it's almost certain that a bond will have to be posted to prevent execution on that initial judgment, and the cost of that bond would come within your policy. And then the expenses you may incur to assist in the defense, such as travel, lodging, and things of that sort that you would not otherwise have incurred but for the fact that there is a claim, those would come within the policy coverage as well. We then move to first party coverages, and this is the protection that's there for the losses that you sustain. And that could be damage to your aircraft, damage to other aircraft that you might have in your possession, whether it's leased or loaned or whatever it might be. Medical incurred by occupants. Interestingly, here's an area where I think it's important. On your homeowners, on your automobile coverage, here in aviation coverages, you have a provision for med pay. And a lot of people wonder, you know, it's often in most policies a small amount, $1,000 or something of that sort. My suggestion is anytime you have the opportunity to address that, buy the most med pay that you can, which is sometimes limited, maybe at 10,000. It could be more in some other policies, but buy the maximum. Why is that? That is money available in the event of an event that where there could be liability to you or loss. Someone is at your home for a dinner or a party and they fall and injure themselves, break a leg or whatever. It's basically, we're not going to, it happened, we're not going to dispute whether you're responsible or not. We're going to help pay your costs and cover your medical bills so that the object is, one, you don't alienate that individual by leaving them out in the cold, so to speak, and two, that you have the opportunity to hopefully mitigate the prospect of them wanting to seek something more. You cannot turn a television on, certainly in this country today, without being besieged by advertisements by plaintiffs' attorneys seeking to go after what they consider to be wrongdoers for all they can get. And so, you know, this is a way to hopefully mitigate the prospect of that actually happening. And then damage to the insured aircraft from an occurrence. And there we're back to a defined term. You read your definitions portion of your policy to see what they are describing as an occurrence. Is an occurrence, you know, in motion, not in motion? Is it, you know, the ramp rat ran into it with his tow vehicle, or he damaged it while towing it, or what have you. Damage to other aircraft. You know, if you're using a substitute aircraft, which is, as it indicates, similar in type to your typical aircraft, that should be there as coverage as well. Non-owned aircraft, it's not one that you regularly use, but one that would be on a itinerant or temporary basis. And newly acquired aircraft, in other words, those that you've just taken possession of but have not yet been identified as covered under the policy as a listed aircraft. Obviously, it's similar to what you encounter with buying a vehicle. Typically there, you've got 30 days to inform the insurer that you have swapped a vehicle or acquired a new one in order to get them to assess what the premium should be and put it within the scope of your coverage. Exclusions. Oh, here we go. These are the minefield again. They're not going to pay for wear and tear, a mechanical or electric breakdown, or failure, deterioration, or freezing. These are events where, you know, it is not a loss event, but instead is related to maintenance and or you know, your care or protection of your property. Intentional damage. Obviously, if you damage it on purpose, you own it. It's not going to be their responsibility. Things that wear out, and obviously the tires and brakes. And by the way, all of this translates again to your other coverages that you probably have in terms of automobile or things of that sort. Consequential damage. Now, what's consequential? Okay, there is a loss event, and then as a storm, and the hangar doors are blown open. I'm trying to come up with an example for you. And as a result of that, then a failure to protect the aircraft from that exposes it to additional damage that could potentially be considered consequential. So, you know, you do have a duty to mitigate potential exposures as an insured. So you can't just ignore it and let it get worse. Embezzlement, you know, that comes within a fidelity policy. If an employee is stealing from you, guess what? They steal the aircraft, they steal the money. You're not going to be covered unless you have a fidelity policy. And diminution of value, if there is, which interestingly is in that incident I mentioned earlier about the collision on the ramp between the airliner and the corporate air or private air jet. A big issue was the diminution in value, which the insurance policy was not going to pay, and looking to the other parties to come up with, be held accountable for the loss of value because a aircraft now had a damage history. Who's covered? All right, well, you have to have a formal proof of loss, and essentially that is a statement under oath that the insured presents to the insurer saying, this is what happened, and this is the situation I'm dealing with, and I'm making a formal claim. And then policy requirements regarding the operation by approved pilots remain in force. So it's again critical that if you have to list your pilots on your policy, that you make sure that you're adhering to that obligation so that you don't stray outside it and find yourself without coverage. Liens, you know, your lenders, if and it's few businesses that operate without obligations to lien holders for having advanced the funds to acquire assets, whether it be aircraft or otherwise. They're going to have a first priority in distributions of insured funds, because they're going to insist in your loan documentation to be named in your policies as a lien holder, with the expectation that they will be first in line in case there's a loss. And then subrogation interest may be addressed in the insured negotiations for loss payment. And again, that's going back to the interest of the insurer in recovering funds that they have had to advance as a result, and in order to be made whole for what they've had to pay out. How much? Well, an emergency landing. Okay, if you have to put an aircraft down in some remote location that is not amenable to flying back out, then it may, and this could be a helicopter lift from some location, and the cost to do that, or a cost to go in with a crane and a transport vehicle to hoist and haul it out on the roadway. Reasonable cost of repair, and you know, here appraisal or arbitration provisions, you know, cost of repair can vary greatly. Are you using OEM parts? Are you using used parts? What, you know, how much are those parts going to cost? I can assure you that you know, there's a strong argument. Well, if it's as good as it would be if it was from the factory new, then why can't we use a recycled part? Because it will save the insurer money. Yeah, that is an area where be prepared, because there will be issues. Obviously, if a used part will be logged in as such, and that has an impact on the ultimate value of an aircraft at some later date, and so it's a potential place where issues can arise. So be prepared. Stated value. Well, you know, one thing about aviation insurance is that typically you have an agreed value going in as to what the aircraft's going to be insured for. You know, in the course of time, you know, values can typically go down, or they may instead go up. You know, there is a trigger point for staying on top of what's going on with regard to aircraft values, because if you're paying a premium based on a higher than real world value, then you're paying excess for your coverage. And if the value of the aircraft has gone up, but your agreed or stated value is at a lesser amount, you now are underinsured, and you are essentially at risk for self-insuring for that loss of value if you have to replace an aircraft because it's been totally destroyed. Then you have deductibles for in motion and not in motion, and you know, again, this is the value of having a relationship with a broker or agent who knows you, knows your business, knows your equipment, it knows what's realistic out there, and is going to be working with you to, again, tailor coverages to be well suited to your needs. And then we're back to subrogation rights, and if they're paying out, is there someone else that's potentially responsible that they're going to want to seek recovery from, and again, to be made whole. And that brings us to questions. And let's see, it's about a few minutes before 5, so I've tried to stay within our hour, but I'm hopeful that there'll be a bunch of questions because I'm eager to answer.
We do have a handful of questions. Greg, you certainly appreciate that presentation. Let's get right into it. So we will start with one from John Leonard. It says, "Hi, Greg. Interesting presentation, thank you. You mentioned that coverage might be voided if an aircraft is not airworthy. There are plenty of scenarios, such as an AOG, undergoing maintenance, etc., when it might not be airworthy. How can you ensure that you are covered during these scenarios?"
Well, I wish I could throw the question back and say, John, what do you think you should do? But let's take a stab at that in the absence of that ability. Well, if you have to move an aircraft, what's one of that's unairworthy? What's one of the first things you have to do? Obviously, you have to get a ferry permit. That would be a requirement. If you're flying a technically unairworthy aircraft without that ferry permit, then you're at risk of not only an insurer issue, but also an FAA issue, or depending on whatever civil aviation authority you might be dealing with for those folks who are outside of the US. That would be step one. Step two, guess what? I think the simple thing is a communication with your insurer saying, we have this situation and this is what we need to do. We want to have assurance that we have coverage. They may say, no problem, get it in writing, or they may say, well, we'll do that, but we're going to issue an endorsement and there'll be an additional premium potentially. You know, that's one of the avenues. Now, as far as other situations, I can't imagine, you know, if the aircraft's unairworthy, but it's not being operated, I think we're looking at a fairly limited additional risk, and that the insurer is probably not going to make an issue of the fact, well, it couldn't be flown, so we're not responsible under the terms of the policy. I think that would be a stretch. Hopefully that answers the question.
It sounded like it for me. This is a question we actually had come in from last week from Rebecca Duncan. I do understand that she's watching today. Welcome back, Rebecca.
Hi, Rebecca.
When should pilots who don't own an aircraft but fly someone else's, such as an employer, instruction, DPE, get their own insurance, and what kind of insurance should they get?
Well, the answer is yes, they should get coverage, and there's several ways they can go about that. If you're flying an aircraft, the same aircraft on a regular basis that is owned by another party, one of the simplest ways, although there's some logistics involved, is to request that you be named as an additional insured under the policy that exists for the benefit of that owner. What a lot of people do not realize, the coverages for flight schools, aircraft, typically do not provide coverage for the students who are flying those aircraft. They are essentially on their own. If the aircraft is lost, then the flight school will be covered for it, but there's no coverage there for the students, so they may be at some risk. Now, that's not to say that policies can't be written that cover students, but in my experience, the students are self-insured. So the first step would be to look at the prospect of being named as an additional insured under the existing policy. That's probably the most efficient and cost-effective approach for the student. Now, whether the owner of the aircraft and or their insurer is going to be willing to accept that responsibility, that's another story, but it's certainly the way I would go first. There may be some cost. The student may be expected to cover that additional cost if they're willing to provide the coverage. Then the other alternative is there are coverages out there for non-owner pilots to have liability and or personal protection, and that's a matter of shopping. It's going to the market and seeking those coverages. Hopefully that gets you down the road, Rebecca. Safe flying. I'll assume it's going to go bad because it might, and it's better to be ahead of the curve.
Always, always. We have one from Joanna Carroll. If a claim occurs, are rates typically raised, calculated by the severity of the loss, similar to auto insurance?
It's interesting. I had the opportunity to sit with the head underwriters for all the insurers at an event that Terry Palmer had, and for those of you who know Terry, she is a safety activist in Rotary, big time. She organized that was hosted by Bell out in Grand Prairie, and it was carefully conducted so as to avoid those things that you can't do as a group, but it was to address the concern existing particularly in Rotary over the accident rates and what was going to be essential as an industry to try to bring the accident losses down, and accordingly then the exposure to the insurers for those losses. The answer is it depends. It depends on the insurer. It depends on what their experience is during a particular coverage period. Are they having a bad year where they're making their reinsurers, which is typically like the London market in Lloyd's, where coverages are, the company has exposure to a certain limit and your policy might be greater than their limit, but they've sold reinsurance to Lloyd's and they take up the differential. If they're starting to frown because they've been paying out a lot, then you may be at risk of, one, losing your coverage, or two, having a substantial adjustment in your premiums, and that's the reality. And quite frankly, everyone in the industry has a duty to do everything that they can to avoid losses. And yeah, we talk about it all the time, but I will tell you, this is a small boat. In the grand scheme of things, particularly rotary is a small piece of the greater aviation environment. And unfortunately, rotary has a disproportionate level of losses relative to the rest of the industry. And the insurers are well aware of this because they're the ones who are writing the checks to address these losses. And there is a certain measure of discomfort about the direction of things. So where I'm going with this comment is to say, whatever you do everything you can to be as safe as you possibly can so that accidents do not happen. Do your training, do your maintenance, do your pre-flights, always be prepared for what might go bad. Do everything you can, because I will tell you that is going to be the difference maker for everyone. It only takes one person drilling a hole in the bottom of this small boat for the boat to take on water. And if there's too many holes in the bottom of the boat, guess what? It will sink. And so there is a mutual need for concurrency of commitment and action to be safe.
Actually, Greg, that brings up a question. It just occurred to me. We have had a discussion in the past where pilots who go through routine training, regular training, are 10 times less likely to have accidents than pilots who don't train as often as they should. Is that something you can work with an insurance agent or insurance company to show that you are being proactive, and or maybe that's a question I need to refer to an insurance agent?
Interestingly, it was very much a focus of conversation at that very meeting that I referenced. And clearly, recurrency of training and the degree and nature of training is a huge difference maker in outcomes. And it would not be surprising that at some point there is an expectation on the part of insurers that if you want the coverage, these are going to be the obligations that you have to meet in order to secure that coverage. And training being a critical component, especially emergency event or inadvertent IMC and things where the accidents are happening. Those things that are precipitating the losses are where their eyes are tuned. And so we know where those are. All of us are well aware of where those danger points are. And again, our focus needs to be on that in order to make sure that we don't stray into that zone that is unhappy for everyone.
This is a question from Richard Gallagher, who's another former viewer, a regular attendee. Do welcome you back, Richard. Do you know if there's a checklist of what to check when going to insurance companies to look for policies?
Well, we kind of ran through it here today in a way with the who, what, when, why, and how, but well, I don't want to steal my closing comment, but again, I think it's the criticality of the relationship you have with the individual who's going to be working with you to provide that coverage. If you're dealing with somebody who doesn't know you, how do you expect them to give you what you really need? That puts you in the position of self-assessing your requirements or your needs. And I'm not sure that all of us are that good at our own self-assessment or audit. That's where outside eyes from experienced, knowledgeable people are really important. I work with another organization, and the big focus there is accreditation, and for the reason that accredited entities have met standards, and I will tell you, in the legal arena, when it comes to litigation, if there is an individual or an organization that is not meeting the best of industry standards, then their exposures in the event of an adverse event go up dramatically. You know, and here's the reason. You know, you put 6 people in a jury box to hear a death case in an aviation accident. Do you think any of them are going to be aviators? No. Are any of them going to be associated with aviation? No. What are they going to see? They're going to be people that look at you know, flying on a mainline airliner as threatening, and when we talk about you know, flying in a helicopter, oh my God, those things, you know, that's a bag of bolts whirling around in the sky, and you know, they fly over my house and it makes me crazy. You know, it's a perception thing. You know, the minds of the public, and as a legal matter, aircraft and particularly helicopters are considered dangerous instrumentalities, and that is a legal term, which means they're inherently dangerous, and therefore they're associated with greater risks and potential for loss, and that's already 2 strikes against you going in the door. It's really important to be mindful of the fact that, again, you know, we're in that boat. Don't drill holes.
Okay, we've got a question from Mark Hennis. Can a helicopter manufacturer help their customers to lower their insurance premiums?
And I think the answer is absolutely yes. And I'll tell you where it comes from. Don't put somebody in a machine until they're qualified to fly it, that they know how to safely and in every sense operate it, to maintain it properly. You know, the dangerous thing is, hey, it's gone off it's gone out the door and it's not our deal anymore. Good luck. We wish you the best. That I think that is a dangerous thing on the part of manufacturers. I think manufacturers have a, you know, because at the end of the day, guess what? I don't care what event happens. If there's a loss, guess who's going to be named along with everybody else? The manufacturer. They're gonna be a seat at that defense table as well. And so this has got to be a cooperative undertaking on the part of everyone in this industry in order to mitigate losses and avoid the impacts that come with those losses. I'm sorry if I'm harping on this, but it is so patently obvious. And if we're not, you know, we're not eyes on that ball, we're all at risk. And again, when you have one event, it does not fail to tarnish everybody else.
That's interesting because that is so different than automobile insurance, for example, or perhaps it does, you know, they're playing the averages with automobile insurance, but it seems like there would be more of a collective issue here in the helicopter industry that way.
It's a law of numbers. There are millions of automobiles that are covered. How many helicopters are actually flying? What's the registry for the US and even globally? It's not that big. And as a result, you know, your premium pool for the insurers is fairly small because you don't have that many aircraft to cover. Thus, the premiums have to be greater, particularly because if there is a loss, you know, automobile claims don't typically generally result in multi-million-dollar verdicts. You know, they can, but it's not the norm. If there's an aviation loss, you know, you can just about count on the numbers being big. It's rare that you don't have policy limits at risk and at the minimum. And if it's a well-heeled owner, you know, they better have good coverage or you know, excess cover liability coverages, because when the aviation policy runs out, they may be at risk of being sued direct, you know, for amounts beyond what their aviation policy had.
So people who want lower rates should fly safer.
Easy answer. Don't cause claims and your premiums will go down. It will be a better world for everybody. Because, you know, look, the reality is that insurance is essentially a pooling. The insurer takes a piece of the premiums for providing a venue essentially for everybody to share risk. When you have a small pool to share the risk, if there's a loss, guess what? The impacts are much greater in that pool than if it's a large pool. Real basic geometry or mathematics.
We have a question from Ernie Eaton. What are the factors in determining how much coverage is required? Can you give an example?
Well, I think, again, we're back to that relationship with your outside expert who's, okay, what's the value of your business? What's the nature of your operations? You know, what are the risk factors that might be involved in what you do? Are you doing aerial applications on agriculture? Are you doing tourist flights over the Grand Canyon? Are you doing flights through Manhattan? Are you know, what environment are you flying in? I mean, there's all kinds of factors that come to bear. The one thing you don't want to be is underinsured. As a practical matter, it's far better to pay to swallow the bitter pill of having to pay a larger premium than to be caught short at the other end of an experience and not have adequate coverage for an unfortunate event that might happen.
Okay, we're going to start to run out of time here. I'm going to try and wrap it up here in the next 4 or 5 minutes. I'll go through a couple more quick questions. I'm sorry we won't have time for everybody's question, but what happens when the aircraft insured value is higher than the total value and the total loss occurred? How is the claim handled?
Well, if there's been a diminishment of value from the point of time of the coverage inception, you know, the agreed value is the agreed value. That's the benefit of agreed value. If there was a misrepresentation of value, then there's the potential for an argument on the part of the insurer and the insured over, you know, how much is going to be paid. Now, that's back to the truthfulness. Now, I will tell you, the insurers are pretty adept in understanding the market and what the value of aircraft are. They are not going to be lulled into providing, you know, $10 million of coverage on a $1 million asset. That's not going to happen. Could you have a 10% deviation? That's possible, maybe even 20%. But I would say that they're tuned into what aircraft are worth. So it's unlikely you're going to have a huge discrepancy, and accordingly, you would not expect a dispute to arise unless there was fraud.
Next question is from Tom Allen. This one's kind of interesting. I take my friends for flights in my aircraft. Do I need to get them to sign a waiver?
Have you talked to your attorney? Have you talked to your insurer? As much as I always liked my friends, I was always very uncomfortable about handing the keys to the aircraft for the reason that you know, even though I may not be flying it and I may not be on board it, I'm the owner. Therefore, I have liability for what happens with that aircraft, regardless of who's flying it. And so, you know, understand that if you're doing that's called that vicarious liability. And it's the same thing. And here's a quick one for everybody, and I'll try to be quick. Don't own your automobiles together with your significant other. Why? Because if you are jointly owning that vehicle and your significant other has an unfortunate accident and there's liability, you don't want to expose your valuable joint assets to the risk of a claim, because, you know, the owner is as liable as the operator. And if you're a co-owner, then that liability attaches and things upstream from your automobile become at risk. So own independently the vehicles you principally drive. You know, that may not be 100% foolproof because we swap cars now and then or whatever, but it's certainly the smarter move.
Let's go ahead and finish up with our final question, Greg. What would be the most important thing you think people should take away from this presentation today?
hopefully that they don't want to put a noose around my neck. Let me be serious. I hope that this, again, this is a broad brush. It's fairly basic, but hopefully it's been beneficial. But there is one thing that I think is really critical, and it comes back to relationships. It's not about hardware. It's not about coverages. It's what it is if you're concerned, and you should be, that I think that you need to have relationships in place before there's a need to have a relationship. And the reason is this: if you have a crisis, it's a bad time to go shopping for help. It's the worst time. For one thing, if people don't know you, they're going to be very guarded about how quick they are to jump on board. And quite frankly, if there's an adverse event, time is critical. Time is your enemy, and having the ability to pick up the phone and call your lawyer or call your insurance agent or broker is super important. So I'm a firm believer that and certainly for business owners, you should already have, but if you don't, you want to have relationships with, I consider, 4 critical support individuals, and that is, one, an accountant. Your accountant is going to know your business, is going to help you plan how to move your business forward, make money, save having to pay taxes where you can, and be there as a sounding board for decisions you may need to make on what you can do to grow your business. 2, you better have a strong relationship with a banker. Why? I don't know anybody who doesn't have to borrow money in one form or another at some point in time. And the new environment is all this virtual banking. But you know what? Find an institution that you have somebody you can go sit down and talk to face to face, who knows you, likes you, and who will be there for you when you say, hey, I need to borrow, 300,000 or 500,000, or I want to go buy a helicopter. Will you help me, fund that? The next individual, it's clearly, in the subject of this conversation, is a close relationship with a broker or an agent that knows you, knows your business, is going to tailor your coverages to fit your needs, not going to oversell or undersell, is going to make sure that you know what you have to do so that you don't end up without the coverage because you made a mistake. That's super important. And then lastly, and as I talked about at the front end, have a relationship with an attorney. And in this business, it should be somebody who either is an aviation specialist or who has that resource available to them. You want somebody who's a good business lawyer, a litigator perhaps, and all that. That may be a firm where they have the resources that are deep. But I think the most important takeaway is, don't try to swim on your own. You know what? Get the team on board so that you have the support, that you can get through the bad times unscathed, or at least minimally scathed, and succeed. More importantly, with really great times, not just good.
I think that's a great takeaway. Aviation really is a team concept, and building your own personal team is as vital as any other part of the industry.
Absolutely, and I used to call it the 4 horsemen, but that's inappropriate in the modern age. So we'll call it the 4 horse persons that are there for you, ladies. I'm recognizing you here. Don't I give you credit. In fact, I shared earlier with Dave that I had a young lady from in the insurance industry who attended one of these sessions, and we've become good friends, and she's called me on a number of occasions to sound out on things, and hopefully I've given her good guidance. She has said so we'll hope that's the outcome, and hopefully what I've shared here today is good guidance for everyone that's participated, which I really appreciate, and I want to thank all of you for taking the time out of your schedules to listen in.
Well, thank you, Greg. Gosh, I can't tell you how much we appreciate that you were able to share your time and your interest into this topic with us today. I know that we had a number of business owners on, and so I'm certain that they got information that we'll find helpful. And so I'm grateful that you're willing to give back to the industry this way. And so thank you so much for your time and your assistance today.
It's my pleasure. I wish you all the very best, and I look forward to seeing you at Expo the next time we can get together.
We're looking forward to Dallas in 2022. You betcha.
All right. Well, see you there. Seek me out. I'd love to see everybody in person. Thank you.
Thank you,
I'll
Greg.
sign off.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Okay, we've got a few housekeeping things to wrap up on. During Jim's introduction, he did talk about the virtual manufacturer's technical briefings and the virtual flight course and refresher course. Information on both of those you can find so easy on our website. In the upper corner of the screen, you'll see we've got rotor.org. Just type that in. And then here on the front page of the website, we have links for information on both the virtual manufacturer's technical briefings, March 22 through 25, and the HAI virtual flight instructor refresher course, which starts this Sunday. Make sure that you're paying attention to the dates there. Get more information for both of those on the website. Coming up next, HAI at work. Next week, March 25th, we will not have a webinar because of those manufacturers' technical briefings. We feel that those are valuable enough that we don't want to distract from anybody who might want to see those. So please take the opportunity to sign up for those courses through the website. April 1st, this is no joke. We have Romain Trapp, the president and head of North America Airbus Helicopters. He will be joining Jim Viola for a CEO to CEO discussion on some of the highest levels of parts of our industry and his industry, bringing the two together. We also have a couple more exciting ones coming up in April, but you'll have to come back on April 1st to get more information about those dates. As always, there is a follow-up questionnaire that will be coming very shortly. We do appreciate it if you take a few minutes to let us know what you thought of today's webinar, what you think that we might do for future webinars. Let us know what you think about the webinars in general. If you have questions or concerns about HAI in general, we'd love to hear those as well. Please let us know. The easiest way to do that is through the email address president@rotor.org. Those emails go directly to Jim Viola, and he does share them with the staff for action. We do routinely pay attention to them all the time. Routinely do make responses back to the people who send them. That's pretty much it for this week. Until next week, we do ask that you fly safe, that you be safe, and we will see you next, on April 1st. Thursday, April 1st is the next webinar. Be well.